The beautiful thing about watch collecting is that it tells you a lot about the person and their personality. And I'm very excited today here to have Osman. Osman is a friend of Timepiece 360 to find out a little bit more about him, his passion in watches, and really what got him into watches. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so glad we're doing this. Most people don't know this. We tried to do this many years ago. Do you remember we
did it once?
We did it once in Cafe Rider.
Yes.
I think it was about 10 years ago at this stage.
No, not 10 years ago. 10 years ago I was in a different industry.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Oh,
right. You're just old.
It feels like 10 years ago, right? But anyway, so it was delighted. Myself and Khaled are good friends, and he said, "Come in, we'll do some content, speak more about what makes watches personal to me, and why do I collect a particular genre of watches, which we'll kind of dive into a little bit more."
Yeah, so quickly, what got you into watches, and then how did you get a passion down a particular path with watches?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I love answering it. The first was, I used to do a lot of diving in Egypt, and the thing about diving...
Big up Egypt.
Big up to Dahab and the diving team, now the Red Sea. But the thing about diving itself, diving, you need a lot of tools, a lot of equipment. And one of the most important ones that I used to see with some of the older Egyptian divers, he had on these really cool old faded Seikos, do the Seiko SKXs.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, you guys actually use these for diving. And the watches were bleached by salt and by sun, and they just were the coolest things. And you could tell that watch was part of those guys' skin. So that was one of the things. I was getting really big into diving. I'd spent, after uni, I'd spent 2 months living in Fiji. I was scuba diving there. I dived on the east and the west of Australia. And one of the things I wanted was to have, first of all, a dive watch that would actually last and endure. And something then, when I looked into the history of it, something that could be quite unique. And so that launched that aspect. But the second aspect was slightly more personal. I grew up beside an RAF base called RAF Aldergrove in Northern Ireland, where I'm from. And a friend of mine was in the RAF, and he'd been speaking about some of the watches that the pilots were using. And at that base, you would see everything from Chinook helicopters, Tornadoes, Wessex helicopters, real heavy military equipment flying in and out. And I just thought that's so cool that maybe one day I could own a piece of that equipment, or the timepiece that person had worn. And I just dived straight into the whole aspect of owning military watches. And it wasn't the pre-war or the World War I, World War II stuff. It was the stuff that would have been involved in a modern day conflict. When I say conflict, though, Northern Ireland is part of a peace process. So a peace process as well, not just an actual warfare, something that was used for military uses. And that's what essentially spawned it. And it was spawned out of the use that watches essentially, many years ago, were tools. And the idea behind a military watch, it had to be completely robust, completely accurate, and completely reliable. And those really stung to me, especially when I moved from a cold, wet climate in Ireland to a hot and humid climate in the UAE. So I needed something significantly more robust than your leather-strapped Cassie or whatnot. Yeah.
So military watches is what you just mentioned, and that's your passion.
100%. Military watches with a focus on military divers, because my passion was diving. So things like the Doxa Black Lung, the 300T, was the first orange-faced watch in the 1960s. It was featured in Sahara, the movie. Matthew McConaughey was famous for wearing one of that. But the real heavyweight stuff, the interesting stuff, like the Pelagoses, the Marine Militaires, the stuff that would last, that could do a 40 meter, 50 meter dive, and literally then last longer than the diver himself.
So if I was to look at your collection today, it's filled with mainly military diver watches.
Military divers and chronographs.
Military divers and chronographs.
And some issued what we call infantry watches. So the G10. So the G10 was British military. So on that note, I've been lucky enough I've owned several military watches from different militaries, Argentinian military, Pakistan, Air Force, but my main focus is British military. Mainly for one of two reasons. It's more accessible. Some of the stuff, the Argentinian Air Force watches are hundreds of thousands of dollars now. Pakistani Air Force, forget about it. It's a unicorn. You can't get it anymore. So in that sense, the British military is probably the easiest to get.
To find.
and also probably the most wearable as well.
And that's the interesting thing that collections and watches, they, you know, I think we've seen over the last few years hype, and we've spoken about it. I think we've probably overspoken about it now, but it doesn't have to be the case, right? So, you know, a lot of the watches that you've shown me in the past and a lot of military watches, they don't have to be expensive.
Correct.
I know you mentioned now some examples of ones which have shot up, but you can still find a lot of these watches in a lot of places, overlooked by a lot of people and not necessarily expensive.
100%. And one of the ideas behind that is that because it was a military watch, it was part of a kit. So your military kit, your uniform, your boots, everything. So it wasn't an expensive watch. Back in the days, the Royal Navy used to be issued Rolex Submariners.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's changed now.
Budget cuts.
Exactly. Budget cuts. Graham Fowler famously talks about finding a Rolex sub during the beach with the SBS, the Special Boat Service we train. He has, 16 of them though?
Oh, wow.
But so he's been collecting just that genre. But it doesn't have to be just a Rolex. You can look at some of the great stuff. People always laugh when you talk about a Seiko Gen 1. So that actually, the Seiko Gen 1 chronograph was used by Chinook pilots in Afghanistan. Because it was an RAF watch, 6BB, that denotes that it was an RAF issued 6BB. I have a Prasita, which is ordered in 1983. It was the only year that RAF ordered the 6BB for Prasita, 1983, delivered in 1984. And people think, oh, where do you think that served? And ironically, when I looked into it historically, it probably served in South Armagh, Northern Ireland, close to where I'm from. Because at the time, the Air Force base there was the world's busiest helipad, because they were policing essentially the very mountainous range between the north and south of Ireland, where at the height of the Troubles.
Yeah.
So again, you'd be wearing your Prasita 6BB, going up in your Wessex helicopter, and at one stage, I think it was every 38 seconds, there was a helicopter taking off and landing from that.
Oh, wow.
So it was, at one stage, it was the world's, definitely the busiest military helicopter pad, and all the guys were wearing 6BB, so yeah.
So basically, there's a huge price range, and I think that you've got some examples here of what you can define as either a diver's watch or a military watches, and with a good price range, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, I think, you know, if we're talking price range from lowest to highest, we're probably talking like this, right?
Yes, yeah,
Which gives you an idea of range. Right?
Exactly.
And here we're talking around 2,000 dirhams. This is around just over $1,000.
Yeah.
We're talking here around probably just over $3,000. And probably this is the most expensive, which is $4,000 to $5,000.
Exactly.
Which is very accessible, right?
It is, and the entry point to these watches is another reason what makes them so appealing, that you can collect quite a large amount of them, and it's not going to be your massive big ticket item. So for example, let's say, look, I want a yellow gold Daytona. You're going to buy that watch, probably spend 150,000 dirhams, and you're probably never going to wear it because you'd be terrified to bang it off your desk or something and get a scrape. These, as you rightly said, you can buy these and enjoy these as daily watches, as daily beaters, so to speak. I hate the term beaters, but as a daily watch to enjoy, and it's beautiful. Has the Tropic strap. Baltic in themselves are, you know, they have a huge fan base in that sense. They're almost cult-like, and waiting lists of a couple of years. So to see one, an Aquascape in this color, with these markings on that lovely blue Tropic, which is a lovely throwback to the 60s, the Tropic strap, is beautiful. And then moving on from them, so you notice these first three are divers.
Yes.
And the thing about a diver, it's not as complicated as a chronograph. Less movement, less moving parts, even less, you know, buttons, so to speak. But this in itself, I love. And if people are really into military diving and they realize this was a homage, it's made by a company called Mark II, Bill Yao, and Bill himself is a perfectionist. This took probably about 7 years to produce. In that sense, people who would
This
sign
particular model.
Yeah, and it's not because it's complicated. It's just he would go back to the drawing board. He would try to make it more authentic to the real Tonic Rival. It was a TR 990, and the idea behind this was it's essentially a Blancpain 50 fathoms, but Blancpain couldn't tender for the US government, for the US Navy.
Is there a non-US?
It's a Swiss company.
Yeah.
So they said, as you can see on the dial, it says Tonic Rival. So they just changed the name. That was the importer for Blancpain. And they took one of his names, said, okay, we'll make it into Tonic Rival. Excuse me. But we'll keep the key features, the moisture indicator, and we'll produce this. And to this day, if you look up Tonic Rival, you'll see there's only about 6 of them left. And Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so in essence, you're saying this is a based on a Blancpain 50 fathoms watch. We said this is around the 4,000 dirham mark.
Correct.
Particularly in this current auction.
Yeah.
And you have a watch with history and the story, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is that it's a homage. It's not trying to be, obviously it's very honest in what it is, but there's a very famous watch editor, Jason Heaton, as you probably know, and he sort of took a real Tonic Rival for a dive, Blancpain.
How much are the real ones?
$90,000.
Wow.
Yeah, one went recently in a Hong Kong auction for like 200,000.
Wow.
And the point being is that those are museum pieces essentially. Yeah. And one of the things about military watches, because they have so much time-stamped history, they are museum pieces. But something like this means you can have all the enjoyment of owning something as authentic as that, but without the worry of having $100,000 in your wrist.
And maybe just because the term, if you can explain what homage means.
So homage, you see, homage would have started in automotive quite a lot. So it's a homage harking back to the original model. So for example, you'll see, and then the watch industry and automotive are very much aligned in marketing terms. So you would have a homage to, say, a Ferrari 250 GTO.
But it's not Ferrari.
It's not, yeah, exactly. But on watch terms, it's slightly simpler because it's easy to reproduce. So homage, essentially, it doesn't mean copy. It means enthusiastically represented.
Okay, so that's a good way of describing it.
Exactly. And a lot of people, homage used to be a very kind of negative word many years ago, but I think a lot of people understand now that homage just means another way to enjoy an amazing item from many years ago, but in a much more affordable way. And if you mix that with micro brands or independent brands, say Baltic is almost a cult-like independent brand, and they have a waiting list for many years to get one. That allows you to get a homage and enjoy it. Then you see it all the time in Paul Newman Daytonas.
Yes.
You see it in this, but this I think is probably in some ways one of the more interesting homages, because Bill Yao, who owns Mark II, is just fanatical about how he produces these things, and that's why they take so long to make.
No, amazing. I think it shows that watch collecting doesn't have to be expensive, but it's a reflection of someone. It's a reflection of their personality and story. It can be as expensive or as inexpensive as you like. The most important thing is what it tells you and what it says about you and your person. Thank you so much, Osman, for coming in today, for sharing your passion and interest in military diving watches. So now we know who to market to whenever we get these watches coming in.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, guys, and thank you very much for tuning in.